It depends where you're at. You have to be at a certain place and like make sure like you're really ready. But I do think it would help so many trans kids' mental health if they were able to transition before 18.
It's so crazy. Do you see how much more well-reasoned, logical, compassionate, and just chill the responses from actual trans people, even the youth, the teens, compared to conservatives on, you know, the issue of trans healthcare and whatnot, and trans youth? This is, I think, the reasonable argument, or at least it should be. Like, oh, okay, you should be able to medically transition before adulthood? Yes, and I think that it would be beneficial if there was a good amount of safeguards in place. This is why puberty blockers exist and have been seen to be super useful in this regard, not only for trans youth, but also for cis youth when it comes to precocious puberty. All the data around trans youth suggests that, generally speaking, these trans people are trans. The regret rate is incredibly low. So, like, it's just, I don't know, man. Like, can you imagine if this was the normative position? You ask, like, any random Joe on the street, and they tell you that? I feel like that should be it's, like, very easy. It's very logical. So today we have, do all trans teens think the same? Spectrum, new Jubilee video. And by new, I mean it came out 3 weeks ago. So I figure I've been known to trans it up. I've been known to be a trans. And considering all trans people are a monolith, I figured we would just, you know, circle jerk it a little bit, you know, hug box it a little bit and see what's up. So for some background information, for those of you who might not know, I was not a trans teen. At least I didn't know I was trans when I was a teen. I understood myself to be trans when I was in like my early 20s, around like 23-ish. So I don't actually have a whole lot of insight into what the trans youth or trans teen experience is like. So this could be interesting to see. I've got some ideas for like what I've heard and things that I've read. But this could be an interesting, you know, illuminating experience. Might hear about some stuff. But other than that, we'll see if, you know, being a teen, you know, because all teens are stupid, you imagine trans teens are as well. Or perhaps, you know, there's some differences there. Who knows? It could be, I don't even know. All I know is that this looks like a collection of very fun, nice, actualized human beings. And, you know, that's cool to see. So for me anyway, I do remember times in the past, and I've talked about this in previous videos, I do remember some pieces of the puzzle throughout my life where I could have, if I knew more about gender, then, you know, I didn't at the time because I didn't get a good education either at home or at school, I might have been able to understand a lot earlier on. And I think I would have preferred to understand earlier on as well. Though, you know, the ignorance is bliss part of that might be somewhat helpful in hindsight, but probably not. So that's interesting as well going into this video. So we'll see what's up. We'll see if I can vibe with any of the things that these people are saying, even though I don't have the direct one-to-one experience as well.
I hate that every week I have to like inject my hormones. Like I get so angry that like cis people get it for free. And like it's just natural.
Yeah, like you got it in your body, like I got it in a drawer.
So that's, yeah, I understand this, all right? But when it comes to that, you can actually have more control over your hormone levels as a trans person than would a cis person who's just, you know, going along with the default factory settings. So there's the plus side, you know. There are cis people who do hormone therapy for whatever reason, like older men who go on TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. Joe Rogan, famously on TRT, gender affirming care, even for the old and bald. Let's go. So that's a potential upside. It's upsides and downsides, okay? I'm trying to give you silver lining. I'm trying to be positive. I'm trying to be, you know, nice. Absolutely not. What the hell is a goddamn cisgender individual? I've never heard of that in my life. None of those words is in the Bible. Amen. I don't think cis people exist. I'm telling you, brother, I have not seen the proof myself. Never heard of a cis person. Have you ever seen a cis person? I don't know. Don't got none in my family. It's all trans people. So how could I possibly date somebody that doesn't exist? Sorry. Critical support to all my sissies out there. But yes, I would. The other side of this is like, would I prefer to date other trans people? Probably. Or like at least like gender queer people? Probably. Mostly because you would expect those people to have more of an understanding of your own experiences and your continued experience into the future, which is always going to be helpful and nice. It's nice to be able to relate to somebody in that way, especially a partner. So that's like the one caveat. But other than that, I don't really care. Though I will say, T for T is a real thing, trans for trans is a real thing. And the reason for that is because it's usually safer for trans people, especially trans femme people, to date other trans people than it is to try to date cis people. Because, unfortunately, because people are bigoted and we live in a society, especially for trans femme people, like trans women and whatnot, there will be like cis men who think that, you know, the trans person here is actually a cis woman, and then they end up finding out later on that they're not, even though they could like not even tell in the moment, like if the person is completely post-op and they had sex or whatever, and then they find out later on. There's actually been stories of people who have gone and done violence to people after the fact, after they learned that, or during, you know, they find out about the fact that this person is trans, and then they fucking kill them or abuse them, and it's not good. So a really tired talking point that a lot of anti-trans and transphobic people have, especially like TERFs and gender critical people, aka morons, they say like, oh, why don't the trans people, you know, date other trans people? Why is it that these trans women are trying to go into women's spaces and are trying to turn the other lesbians trans? Like it's not happening like that. T for T is a very real thing because it's self-preservation. Generally speaking, it's usually just going to be safer for trans people to date other trans people, and a lot of trans people do.
I've dated cis people in the past, and like every time, like especially because like I'm a female at birth and non-binary, like if I'm dating like a man, he typically just sees me as a woman. Like I saw a TikTok literally yesterday. It was like, have you all ever been with a they them woman? I was like, that is so like no. If you can't see me as
shouts out to my they them women out there if you are that though.
Outside with you, like with women that are cis, like it's more welcoming, but like people like they perceive us as like a lesbian couple, and that's not really like what I'm trying to do.
At my age.
Oh, so to clarify, by the way, that person is non-binary. So to say they, them, woman to a non-binary person would be misgendering because they're not a woman, they're not binary. But there are women out there that use they, them pronouns.
It's just weird because they either want one thing or another thing, and usually like I'm subject to be fetishized. Like some guys will like come at me and like be like yeah, like you're like the best of both worlds, and I'm like, girl, this is not Hannah Montana. Like, I am a girl. I want to have like my own little moment where I could just get my own Prince Charming and stuff like that and just have a normal, you know, relationship like the rest of these cis girls.
Yeah, so the unfortunate consequence of that, the fetishization and the chaser kind of mentality. So for those who don't know, a chaser is somebody who specifically seeks out trans people, usually trans femme people, because they like the idea of them being trans. And it's usually like cis men doing this, let's be honest, but not always. They like the idea of trans people, specifically like pre-op, especially if that person wants like any kind of procedures but doesn't have them yet. It's usually like, oh, do you still got a dick or whatever? And it's really fucking weird and cringe. It's not good. It can lead to all manner of like even stalking or abuse. And that's just the unfortunate product of the fetishization of not only trans people, but also the fetishization of femininity that I talk about a lot on this channel. Because it's often happening to trans femme people. I would imagine it still happens to people that are not trans femme, that are trans masc or whatever else. But generally speaking, this seems to be the unfortunate consequence of heterosexual cis men. And it's not good. It's not fun. So that's to say, it is only morally okay to be a chaser if you're also trans. I'm just kidding. That's an in-joke. All right, listen. T for T is based.
I've only been with one cis person, and it was a girl, and I feel like, if anything, girls are super understanding, but I'm still open to a cis person. Like, it depends on the person, really. Like, I'm not looking for a trans person. I'm just looking for a good person.
Fair, but you repeat yourself. Generally speaking, cis women seem to be more empathetic, more available emotionally, and more understanding of people being trans, right? So that's usually why. So like for a heterosexual cis woman who ends up being attracted to a trans man, you're gonna be less likely to have that cis woman subject that trans man to any kind of abuse, because one, they might like not care that they're a trans man, or two, if they do, I feel like they would be less likely to be violent. I don't know if there's data to, you know, explain any of this because it's a very niche topic, but generally speaking, it seems to be cis men doing violence against trans women and trans femme people.
You should be able to medically transition before adulthood. 3.
Yes, I would agree with that. So I guess it depends on how you define before adulthood, which you would imagine would normally be the age of majority or whatever, which is 18. I would say yes. Now, of course, if you're like super young, if you're a trans youth, there is already all manner of gatekeeping in the medical community, the medical system, when it comes to trans healthcare, even for adults to be able to get the care that they want. There is even more gatekeeping when it comes to trans youth. There's usually you have to have multiple like diagnoses of gender dysphoria. You usually have to talk to all manner of mental health and medical health professionals before you can do anything. You usually have to meet like certain thresholds of having socially transitioned in some places for some amount of time, usually years, before you get considered for anything else past that when you're a lot younger. And I think a good amount of caution in that regard is warranted, because it can be the case that somebody's not actually trans and they find that out later on, which is why things like puberty blockers exist. When a person who is trans or thinks they might be trans gets to the point where they're going to be going through puberty, they can get put on a puberty blocker, just like cis youth who go through a precocious puberty, a puberty that's too early. They get put on a puberty blocker. They take more time with the aid of those medical professionals, their parents themselves, analyzing the whole situation. And then if they find out that they are trans, they move on to HRT to affirm their gender. If they find out that, oh, I'm not actually trans. I thought I was, but it turns out that I'm actually not, after I've, done more looking into that myself. And then they get off the puberty blocker. They go through a late puberty potentially, which is virtually harmless, and then they go about their lives. It's a fairly straightforward process, and that's the reason why that's the standards of care for trans healthcare for youth. Now, I will say that, especially for adults, the medical gatekeeping is fucking bullshit. It's not very good, especially depending on where you live. Now, obviously, in this case, I'm usually going to be talking about blue states, unfortunately, because a lot of red states are trying to completely outlaw literally any trans people existing, even adults, but especially it's all targeted around the youth. So that's a little bit of a caveat, I suppose, because that's a different scenario than if you're in like a blue state or like a swing state, because Republicans hate you and want you to suffer. And they don't want trans people to exist and will do whatever they can to achieve that goal. It's just a different thing to worry about, different context.
2, 1.
I have no idea why any of these people would not agree to this prompt.
We have realized that this is what's best for us, like as kids, and it's all about your mental health and well-being. But also, that being said, I think it's also important that this is what you really want, because it's going to be a life-changing decision, and behind that, there should be a lot of evaluations and a lot of affirmations.
That's basically what I was gonna say. It's like, it depends where you're at. You have to be at a certain place and like make sure like you're really ready. But I do think it would help so many trans kids' mental health if they were able to transition before 18.
It's so crazy. Do you see how much more well-reasoned, logical, compassionate, and just chill the responses from actual trans people, even the youth, the teens, compared to conservatives on the issue of trans healthcare and whatnot, and trans youth? It's like the basic point is individual liberty, bodily autonomy. Obviously, if somebody's super young, there should be a process involved to make sure that they really understand everything about themselves to the point where they can make that kind of a decision with the help of their parents and the medical professionals and all that. But outside of that, it's literally just individual liberty. Let people do what they want and be who they want to be. Especially if they're youth, they get a lot of help figuring that out too, ideally in a good healthcare system. It's such a easy answer to arrive at. But of course, everything on the right is got to be super sensationalized and always going to be lies spread about trans youth and trans people in general. A lot of grotesque imagery talked about when it comes to like mutilation or whatever, because they don't have any actual argument. This is, I think, the reasonable argument, or at least it should be. It should be the normative position. Like, oh, okay, you should be able to medically transition before adulthood? Yes, and I think that it would be beneficial if there was a good amount of safeguards in place just to make sure somebody knows that. This is why puberty blockers exist and have been seen to be super useful in this regard, not only for trans youth, but also for cis youth when it comes to precocious puberty. And then you go from there and you figure it out. All the data around trans youth suggests that, generally speaking, these trans people are trans. The regret rate is incredibly low, and also with trans adults. So, like, it's just, I don't know, man. Like, can you imagine if this was the normative position? You ask, like, any random Joe on the street, and they tell you that? I feel like that should be it's, like, very easy. It's very logical, especially for trans adults. I think the normative position for trans adults, for, like, people generally, you ask a random person on the street, unless, like, I guess you're in, like, the deep south and, like, the reddest possible districts. You ask a person, should you be able to medically transition, generally speaking? Like, should adults be able to medically transition even? And they'd be like, well, it's their fucking body and their life. Why do I give a shit? I think that's the general take. Anything else is fucking absurd, especially when it comes to adults. It's like, why do you care? Why is this a thing that you're worried about? Like, how does it affect you? It's the same for abortion stuff. It's the same arguments, bodily autonomy, it's individual liberty. Why the fuck do you give a shit if some random person gets an abortion? Why do you feel the need to control that? Could you possibly be compensating for some of your own insecurities? Perhaps. But this is not a good way to do it. Go to therapy, man. What are you doing?
I'm dying to get on hormones, and I do agree that kids like should be able to get like hormones and go through HRT, but like there's also like a little part of me that's like, what if they end up changing their mind?
Like when I was 13, I thought I was a trans man, and then I was like, nah. And then I was like, wait. So it was like, for me, it was just like a lot of like questioning and going through different identities until I found what felt right. And like at the point I'm at right now, like I don't even know if I want to go on like HRT. So if I—
And that's completely fair. Also, you notice that, right? They said that they went through all kinds of different identities before arriving at the position they're at now. Like a conservative will make fun of that immediately. They're like, oh my God, you don't even know what you are. You're so confused. Like one day you're a man and one day you're a woman. One day you're not. Like, well, make up your mind. And it's like, this person is trying to understand themselves better than you do right now at the old age of what? You're like 56 with your wraparound Oakleys talking about this shit. No shit, somebody's gonna go through a lot of different stages when it comes to their identity if these are questions that they're having. Obviously, a person who knows that they're cis, first of all, you should already question your gender identity regardless of if you're trans or not. It's a good thing to understand yourself well enough to know that you are cis. That's good. It's a good thing to understand yourself enough to know that you are trans. There are people out there that have not really thought about that too much. And the answer to the question could be, yes, I am cis, and that's good. Because now you know more about yourself. Now you're more solid about your gender identity and your identity generally speaking, which can only make you a more actualized human being. It can only make your life better to understand that about yourself. So the idea that it's like, oh my God, you go through all these, you go through gender like, women change clothes. It's like, yeah, because people are trying to figure it out. What's the problem? If one day somebody says they're a trans man, but now they're non-binary, but now, they're actually a cis woman, fuck it. I don't give a shit. They're figuring it out. Person in chat says, personally, I don't think minors should be allowed to transition because their brain isn't fully developed. I don't think your brain is fully developed, my man, because you seem to disagree with the medical and scientific consensus on the issue. But, what can you do? Think you should be 18 for pretty much anything? That's a dumb idea, especially in the context of this conversation around trans issues. Should we wait until people are post-puberty to be able to allow them to transition to the point where their puberty has already irreparably changed their body in ways that they don't want and they know they don't want? And they have confirmed that they don't want with the intervention of mental health and medical professionals, themselves and even their parents? Probably not. This is why the standards of care is what they are. That's why the medical and scientific consensus on the issue is what they are. Through the absolute hoops and hurdles you have to go through to even transition as an adult medically, it is even more extreme for youth. Not for trans stuff? Okay, good clarification. Though the other person was agreeing about the trans stuff, so I was more talking to them.
I think as long as we educate children on like the risk on transitioning very young, like medically transitioning very young, and they're educated on the process, I think children should be able to choose whether or not they want to transition young.
Teachers are accepting my pronouns. Well, I don't actually know, but if I look back to my school, probably not. I don't think they would have been. My sex ed was fairly inadequate, generally speaking, but also didn't talk about gender identity at all. It just talked about like sex ed stuff. Whereas I think that gender identity should be discussed in sex ed as well. I don't see why it wouldn't be. You would obviously be teaching people the correct information about gender and sex being different things. I think it would be helpful just for people to be aware, for cis people to be more understanding of trans people and accepting of trans people, as well as for any trans people to understand that, wow, that's a thing that exists. This, describes a bunch of the feelings that I've already had, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think that my school and the teachers in it would have been super accepting. Some of them might have been, though. I had some cool teachers.
3, 2, 1.
So this is Jubilee, and I think Jubilee is stationed in California, the communist California. But I don't know if like some people fly in or whatever. I'd be curious, because if this is all a bunch of Californiites, you'd imagine that they, generally speaking, have a better experience than people, say, in Louisiana when it comes to being trans. But I don't know. I know there are some fairly conservative areas in California, but generally speaking, the state overall is very libbed up.
I went to UCI for a quarter and they were very understanding and like they don't really like ask questions. But in high school, it was definitely a struggle because like my name was a different name on the roster and then like I would have to explain.
I'm honestly really thankful that they really did try to find a way to like make trans people feel a bit more comfortable.
Hell yeah.
Like right now I'm taking like a ballet and Pilates class and I totally thought it was gonna be, oh, but you were like born male, so you have to do like masculine presenting stuff, which I was like really afraid of, but I'm so glad that they're like really accepting.
This is what we want to see, chat. A brighter future. Imagine if that was everybody's experience. Let's fucking go. One day. One day.
Right now, and I get misgendered there like on a daily basis. Like,
wait, so where is this?
I go to UC Berkeley right now.
UC Berkeley? Wait, isn't that communist university that Ben Shapiro got protested at or some shit? Isn't that the one? Anybody in chat know? It wasn't that like the big thing many years ago where Ben Shapiro was gonna talk there? And yet, this communist, socialist, postmodern, neo-Marxist, Maoist, third worldist university is misgendering a trans person? No way.
And I get misgendered there like on a daily basis. Like, I will introduce myself.
Except it was Milo. I think it was also Ben Shapiro, but
teacher, and I'll be like, I go by they, them pronouns, by the way, I'm non-binary, like, please respect my pronouns. And like within 2 times like that I'm in the classroom, they'll go back to using she, her pronouns, and like other classmates will also misgender me, and it gets just really mentally taxing at a point. And so I kind of just like stop trying as much because like it's just mentally exhausting having to realize like no one sees you as non-binary because you still have like feminine qualities about yourself.
I will say, by the way, whenever people talk about like the constant misgendering that they're subject to, obviously a lot of that could be malicious. A lot of that can just be like lack of care as well. It could also be genuine mistakes. You should always be cognizant of that. It's a very context-based situation. It's like a play-by-play kind of thing where even I, a trans person who is deep in the sauce of gender ideology, still sometimes fucks up and uses the incorrect pronouns with a person. The difference there being that when I am corrected, well, usually I'll correct myself. So like say somebody goes by he, him pronouns, but I use she, her instead, or they, them instead. I'll be like they, sorry. Even if I'm like, even the person's not present, I will still say that. But if I don't remember, and if I fuck it up and I do get corrected, let's go. Correct me every time I do this shit so that eventually I stop making the mistake. All right. It's a thing that people go through. It's a learning process for a lot of people that are not very familiar with people being trans, people using pronouns they don't expect that person to be using. So it's very contextual. Ideally, you should be able to understand when somebody is being malicious and when somebody is making an honest mistake. When it comes to faculty at a school, if they are told that these are the pronouns that you're supposed to use, sure, you could fuck up every now and again, because everybody can. But especially for people that are faculty at a school, if it is a consistent problem that you're doing that, you should be, having talks with like the higher ups and trying to figure out why that is. Because why the fuck? It's a good question. Why is that the case? Why do you consistently misgender this person even after being corrected? Seems like an infraction of some kind.
I have come out more than once. 3, 2, 1.
I've come out multiple times, like not just like for my like trans experience.
Oh
but
shit. I have come out more than once. For me personally, not really. I don't know that I've ever done a coming out post or anything like that. I just understand my gender identity at a certain point and then I exist. And like if people ask me questions about it, then I talk about it, obviously. But I've never done that. But I guess it depends on how you define coming out. So like, for instance, if I first thought that I was a trans woman, but now I understand myself to be non-binary, but now I understand myself to be a trans, like, whatever other flavor, and then you do a bunch of different comings out for that, that's perfectly fine and reasonable and understandable, right? Because every human being, ideally, should be in a constant process of reaffirming what they know about themselves, in a process of self-actualization to eventually be the person that they want to be. Everybody does this. Even like cis people do this. There are people that'll go through different clothing styles. There will be people who go through different ways of speaking. There will be people who go through different hobbies or different interests in similar ways for these things that are, not the same as gender identity. or sexuality, but are a big part of who they are, of their personality. Like when you're a kid, you might be super into sports, but then when you grow up, you're not anymore and you're actually more academic. It's a similar kind of vibe for those of you who might not be able to understand the trans experience. It's a similar kind of thing. Obviously, you know, there's degrees to which these things are like massively impactful to a person's life, but it's a bit similar. I'm trying to make analogies for people. Do you not feel that with each quote-unquote social group that you need to come out with them? Not trans but bi, it definitely felt like I had to choose my words with some groups and others. Well, that does make sense, yeah. Like if you're meeting new people, eventually, you know, the topic of your gender or sexuality might come up, and then that's kind of a coming out thing. So that could be another way to look at it, though I don't know that that's necessarily how the panel here will interpret the question. But that does make sense.
I've come out multiple times, like not just like for my like trans experience, but for like my sexuality as well. Because I came out as like pansexual, then I came out as bi, and then I was just came out as non-binary before I came out as trans. I'm like, oh my god, like when are we gonna get it right, y'all? Like,
I kind of feel like I have to come out like every single day, just like with new people I meet in my life. Like,
oh,
I'm
so here's
constantly
your
having to be like, oh,
person
yeah,
in chat.
My name's Vandy. I'm non-binary. I go by they,
Your
them pronouns.
interpretation.
Please respect those pronouns, or this is not like a safe space for me.
I get the like.
Damn, I have so much sympathy for people that have a strict adherence in their identity to a single set of pronouns. Because like I've been using any and all pronouns for a while now. Like I never have to worry, which is very fortunate for me because I am comfortable with that. Like I'm fine with people using he, him, they, them, she, her, whatever else. So I have a lot of sympathy for people who don't, because goddamn, that sounds exhausting.
Like, I want people to know immediately that I'm trans because I don't want to bring it up later on and have it be an issue with them. I feel like
Fair.
I only came out once because after the first time, I kind of made it visible and I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to have to come out again. And I
That is
thankfully
also
have very
fair.
supportive people in my life that, like, I could have came out to again, but I felt a lot more comfortable just kind of like living my life and having people just like accept what I'm doing with my life without, you know, coming out again.
So like that's what's really interesting about conservatives who are usually be like, oh my god, all you queer people, you make your sexuality or whatever your entire personality. And that's actually, I think that would be like part of what this person is talking about. The idea of like, after the first time, I kind of made it visible. So like if people have like trans patches or whatever, or they have like a trans flag in their background, like they have these signifiers not only for other people that are trans or sympathetic to trans people, but also to just let people know, generally speaking, like, yo, I am a trans person. This should not be shocking to you. If you know, begin to interact with me as another human being, it might be difficult for you, but like, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. So like what's interesting about this and what I like about this video is that a lot of the things that the panel is talking about, I've not had to experience myself personally. Mostly because one, I guess I understood myself to be trans very late in the game. At least late compared to them. And I use any and all pronouns and have for a long time and am non-binary / agender. So like a lot of this shit just does not apply to me. So it's really interesting to see. Luckily, though, my brain is so huge that I have talked about this stuff before. It's interesting, you know, it's a lot of stuff that I don't personally experience, but I'm still able to understand it, be empathetic and sympathetic to it, and also relay that information to all of you. I think it's a good way to be. Is gender completely made up, though? I definitely feel gender. Well, the social concept of gender is socially constructed, meaning that for a while, you'd imagine before society was formed, and when, you know, people were just banging rocks together, before, like, the standard Homo sapien with the intelligence that we have came to be, etc., 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 biological sex was the main thing that people were worrying about, and it wasn't really much more to do than that. The thing is that gender identity and sexuality are different, meaning that biological sex, you know, involves your chromosomes, the hormonal wash that you'll get in the womb, and then eventually the second round of hormones that you get when you go through puberty, as it corresponds to your biological sex. But all of the things we associate with being assigned male at birth or being assigned female at birth, you know, boys have to wear blue and play with G.I. Joes, and eventually they have to go into like manual labor jobs, and, you know, they can't do ballet or gymnastics because that's for girls. All of that stuff is socially constructed. We've made all that shit up, and you can tell that that's the case because throughout history, throughout recorded human history, the expectations for men and women have differed. It used to be the case that young boys would be dressed up like girls. See also FDR's baby photos or whatever. This is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, previous president of the United States of America. Back in this time, all children were dressed in this way. regardless of if they were assigned male or female at birth. And then eventually, once an AMAP person went through puberty, they started adopting all of these, social expectations for what a man is supposed to be. So, like, it was not any kind of discrepancy between boys have to dress this way and girls have to dress that way, because this is, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? So this is even in super recent history in America. So all of that shit is socially constructed. We make it up. But obviously the biological stuff, that's all scientific. So at any point in time, before you can understand all of the socially constructed aspects of gender, that's what, people are going to go off of. But not always. There are trans animals out there. There are a variety of animals that can trans their sex in order to procreate. I think, isn't it not like seahorses? If they can't find an adequate mate or whatever, they can trans their sex in order to find a mate or whatever. Some shit like that. There's some crazy shit going on in nature, man. They don't have gender. They have biological sex because they don't have the intelligence, the capacity to understand what having a gender identity is. So that's how humans are different in that way, because we have society. We have social constructions, social conventions.
Cisgender individuals do not understand my struggles.
I think the answer to this question is, generally speaking, I would not expect them to right off the bat. However, I think anybody has the capacity to understand the experience of another person. Should they have the capacity to hear other people's experiences, learn from them, also learn from any kind of academic sources as well, and arrive at the conclusions of at least knowing enough about another person's experience that, you can understand at least as much as is possible without having had that experience yourself. This idea that like cis people could never know what it's like to be trans, I guess it depends on how you define that, the never know part of that. Like if they're literally never trans, then they might not have that like very deep understanding of what it means to be trans. But I do think that people can learn enough to the point where they can understand. There's a difference between knowing what it's like to be trans and understanding what it's like to be trans. The knowing part, I think, would usually be relegated to people who are trans, or even like cis people who have gone through that process of trying to understand their identity, who end up understanding themselves to be cis, right? But I think anybody can understand it given enough education and, empathy.
Personally, my friends try to empathize, and I really appreciate that for them. But personally, I think that cis people take for granted, their gender euphoria. Getting
That's
ready
fair.
in the morning and looking at yourself and having the absence of distress. Like when I get up and I get ready and I look at myself physically, like I'm distressed, like I don't look like the person I was just dreaming I was,
So I will say that, generally speaking, that might be the case. But there are a lot of cis people that do not feel that they are meeting their gendered expectation, and they're not actually feeling that gender euphoria all the time. See also manlets, right? Like really short men, really skinny men. Men have difficulty putting on bulk. If there are men out there that want to be very masculine, and that's how they want to see themselves, but they don't have the capacity to be because society sees short men as less masculine and less valuable, which is fucked. Shouts out all my manlets out there. I know the struggle. Those people are going to have a similar kind of experience when it comes to gender dysphoria. It might not be the same as a trans person. It might not be as impactful as a trans person's, but it's a similar kind of thing. I'd like to talk about this a lot, and I have for a while, as a way to kind of like give cis people an insight into how they can try to understand gender dysphoria, being that there are going to be women out there that say are very hairy. And because currently in society, we see being hairy as masculine, and we expect feminine people to not be hairy with like body hair and whatever else, there will be women who like feel really bad about that, have to spend all manner of time shaving or getting hair removal, which can be very costly. Coincidentally, trans femme people are usually also trying to get body hair removal as well for gender affirmation. It is still gender affirmation if a cis woman gets body hair removal. So I don't think this is this person's intent, but I don't think the takeaway from that claim, which generally speaking, I think is fair, like, I don't think a lot of cis people take their gender euphoria for granted. I think that is a fair statement, because you'd imagine a lot of cis people don't really think about their gender identity that deeply outside of maybe some things they wish were different about themselves, like being taller or being more muscular or being less hairy or whatever. I think that is like a fair assumption to make. But I don't think it's the case that all cis people are just always super euphoric about how they look. Because we all got shit, we don't really like and would like to see be better about ourselves. That's just a classic facet of the human experience. Completely normal. It's just the case that trans people have an additional hurdle to jump over that makes, the difference.
Like, I've known people that were cis and then would kind of be like transphobic towards me, and then after a few years they start transitioning and they're like, oh, I understand now. And like, it wasn't until they were going through it and really felt the pain of it that they were able to understand.
True. And on the same side of that coin, cis people who, for a period of time in their life, thought that they might be trans, but then eventually understood that they were cis, there was going to be a point in time for a person like that, and those people do exist, that they are able to experience what being trans is like, but they're still cis at the end of the day. So the idea that like cis people can't understand a trans person's struggles, I don't think is fair. Because there could be a lot of cis people out there that were trans at one point or were questioning their gender identity at one point, who eventually came to the conclusion that they weren't trans. You would imagine that would give them some amount of insight.
I think of just like the whole entire spectrum of just like cis people who are like identifying female, but for some reason their bodies present more masculine. I feel like they can have that sort of point of view that can help them sympathize and empathize for you more. It's all about
Bro, these teens are smart as hell. That's crazy.
the spectrum and just how there's just so many nuances.
And not just because they're reciprocating a lot of the points that I've been talking about for a long time. Surely none of these people are conure viewers. If you are, though, shouts out.
Life would be easier if I wasn't trans. 3, 2, 1.
I feel like that's a hard agree for everybody. It definitely depends on the context of each individual person's experience. But generally speaking, the prompt of life would be easier if I wasn't trans, generally speaking, that's probably going to be true. Because if you're trans in our current society, especially if you're living in a very conservative state, you're subject to all manner of transphobia, of oppression, of marginalization, potentially abuse and violence. And if you were just cis, like people would expect a person to be, you wouldn't have to deal with a lot of that. Now, if you were still gender nonconforming as a cis person, then maybe, because then you're met with usually a lot of homophobia, even though it might not even apply. Because you could be a cis person who is just a femboy or whatever, a cis het femboy, they exist. So generally speaking, I think that would be most people's takeaway. But it does depend on how you interpret the question. Life would be easier if I wasn't trans. If you interpret that question to be like, oh, well, my position is I would prefer to not have been trans, then I would not agree with that. Because people have asked me oh, if you could be born cis, whatever you wanted to be, would you do that? Would you take that pill or whatever? And the answer is no. Because I like being trans. I like the amount of thought I've had to put into my identity. I like the person that I am, and I feel better about the person I am now than I ever have been. I am very happy with the fact that I am trans, and I don't think that I would have that similar understanding of myself as a human being if I was born cis as the, identity that I was, trying to be. But I'm also a non-binary, agender, any and all fucking amoebic blob. So if you were to tell me to choose one of the two sexes to be born as instead, I would still be amab because I like being trans femme. It's weird. I wouldn't want to be born female because of that. Because I like the fact that I'm amab. I just wish that I could have been socialized as a girl. I think would have been cool. Maybe. But if not that, because I'm also okay with a lot of the male socialization that I've gone through. If not that, I wish I would have known about this earlier and been able to, start my social and or medical transition earlier. But, I also grew up in a very conservative area. So if I did know I was trans a lot earlier and it really ate at me when it came to dysphoria and all this kind of shit and wanting to be out and myself, then that would have been a pain in the ass and I didn't have to go through that necessarily because I didn't know what being trans was for a while,
I'm already a person of color. If I wasn't non-binary, I'd be a woman. So life is not going to be easy for me. And I just feel that it wouldn't be the same, but it wouldn't be necessarily easier.
I mean, I agree with what you're saying about being a person of color and being queer, but I've been through so much horrible shit and personally my life would be easier if I was cis. I mean, a defining part of who I am is definitely being trans, but every day I do wonder, what if I was actually born a cis female,
I also do think that that's very fair as well. So for me personally, I like that I am trans, and if given the choice to just be cis as whatever, like I said before, I wouldn't take the chance. However, I do think it's perfectly reasonable and acceptable to not have that position, to be yes, I wish I was born cis whatever, the identity that I am currently. I think that's totally fair as well. I don't think there's any reason why that would be a bad thing.
I wonder what life would be like if I was cis, or I kind of wish I was cis. Like I know I wouldn't be where I am, and I wouldn't know almost anyone in my life if I wasn't trans, and if I didn't go through the struggles I went through. I hate that every week I have to like inject my hormones. Like I get so angry that like cis people get it for free, and like it's just natural.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, and there's times where my insurance is being like annoying, and I
True.
can't get my
You
hormones.
got it in your body. Like, I got
Welcome
it
to
more.
America.
Yeah, like it's really, really hard and like breaks me down, but I know that I wouldn't be who I am if I wasn't trans.
Yeah, just like bouncing off that, just the thought of like waking up and not having dysphoria about something, and like not trying on like 15 different shirts because my chest doesn't look flat enough, or like just stuff like that. I think it would genuinely make my life easier. But again, it's like I wouldn't meet the people that I have in my life, and I'm so grateful for them.
Hell yeah. Poggers! That's a pretty good video. It's interesting too, because like if I think about how this video might have gone, they probably do have this already. With adults instead of teens who are trans, I feel like you'd get different answers. Mostly because a lot of trans adults might be more subject to all manner of internalized bigotry, internalized transphobia. They've also gone through a period of time where trans acceptance was not as high as it currently is, and it's not as high as it should be, but certainly it was worse back in the day. So they have to deal with all that, and there could be all manner of things that would affect their answers in that way. So it's really cool to see this, you know, focused on trans teens and their experiences, because these people are going through the modern day being a trans youth, and that is an incredibly different experience than the one that I've had, which is really cool to see. Femboys are trans now? No, they don't have to be necessarily. You can be a cisgender femboy. That being said, you could be a trans femboy as well. If you're a trans man, for instance, and you identify with the term femboy, you're a femboy. If you're a non-binary person, but you identify with the term femboy, you could be a femboy. Femboy seems to be an aesthetic descriptor. It seems to be a way of dressing. There doesn't seem to be any strict adherence outside of the fact that the word boy is in the name that precludes anybody from using the term. Though, generally speaking, you would imagine the majority of people who identify with the term femboy are also identifying as men. I think that's a fair assumption to make, though you shouldn't, like, act in weird ways on that assumption. It's stupidly easy for me to get T as a cis male? Yeah, well, that's because you're a boy, Alec. And this is a boy's world, a man's world, you son of a bitch. Have you apologized for being a man yet today, Alec? What's wrong with you? It is true, though. I've heard that a lot from cis men, that it is exceptionally easy to get T, to get testosterone. Literally just a phone call? Jesus. And money? Oh, shocking. They don't just give it out for free. Well, that was a really good video. I had a lot of fun with that. I think it was some good chats. I do worry that it's a bit of a rehashing of a lot of the shit I've been talking about for a long time. But, you know, fuck it. YOLO. It is interesting, too, the fact that testosterone is super easy to get, because testosterone is actually more dangerous of a hormone. You have to be a lot more careful with it, because shit goes fucking crazy if you're not. That's what I've heard. That's actually interesting, Axel. Imagine the term actually, sweaty. 25 reasons why the term YOLO is problematic and insensitive to people who believe in reincarnation. A thread. That's silly.